Hello. Can you hear me okay? Great. Brilliant. Thank you very much for coming along. Before we start, the quick question I want to ask is, how many people here sort of know about esports? Put your hand up. Great. How many people here think they really understand esports? Good, you're very confident. I should hope so. Excellent. Right, well, we're going to kick off with a little video which will set the mood. So, here we go. I'm going to do a little bit of a tweak here, and then we'll be up and running. So, my name is Laurie, and I'll be joined very shortly by the other handsome gentleman at the front, James Dean, and we look after ESL in the UK. We've been asked to talk today a little bit about what are esports. I'm going to give you a quick overview of who we are. ESL is the world's largest esports brand. We have offices all around the world and almost 500 employees now. In numbers, I think the biggest number that I want to tell you today is that last year, over 160 million hours of our content was consumed on Twitch. There are over 6 million registered users using ESL Play on a daily basis. And our biggest concurrent number so far is actually bigger than that, it's 1.3 million peak concurrent viewers at our biggest event. It had over 27 million people watching online. We've been asked today to talk about what makes a great esports game. We're going to have a stab at that and let you know what we think. But the first question is, what is esports? I think that's quite an interesting question, and one that a lot of people have had a go at answering. Does anyone here want to, for a prize that doesn't actually exist, does anyone here would like to have a guess at what esports is, or have a guess at a definition of esports? You will be my favourite person in the room if you have a guess at this. No, I'm going to call someone out because I'm like that. You, sir, at the front, what do you think esports is?
Competitive gaming.
Excellent, very good. Esports is the natural evolution of multiplayer gaming. And I think at its core, that's the definition that I personally subscribe to the most, but I think that a lot of people should think of esports in that way. Once you peel away the layers, ultimately esports is just the natural evolution of multiplayer gaming. And here we are back in 1980 at the National Space Invaders Championship in 1980, right? This is a single-player game experience, Space Invaders, but no one would argue that that isn't esports, right? People sitting and playing at their consoles. There was no networking back then. There was no multiplayer. It was a single-player experience, setting the highest score that they can, judged by referees. You can't see in this picture, but I'm certain there would have been someone commentating over the top, and an audience. It looks like people's parents right there watching. But an audience spectating. So when we think of esports, I don't want you to think of it as a new phenomenon. I want you to think of it as something that has existed for a long time. And here we are last year in Katowice in Poland. 120,000 people attended this event. You can see in the audience here, everyone focused on watching the top 10 Counter-Strike players in the world battling it out on stage. It's the same. All that's changed is some technology to make that happen. Now, a lot of people in the games industry are interested now in engagement. How can we engage our consumer? Because they know that engagement equals revenue, especially with the free-to-play phenomenon that we saw of the last 4 years. So I would argue that esports drives engagement. I took a random screenshot yesterday of Twitch homepage, looking at the top 12 games that are being watched, that people are engaging with on Twitch right now. Now there's a commonality there, there's a thread, that 11 of those 12 games on there are multiplayer games, or have a competitive element to them, right? I don't think that's statistical chance, I think that that's because people want to engage with the narrative of esports. So we're going to go back to the question of what makes a great esports game, and we're going to look at games in general. How many people here are developers? Can you put your hand up if you are developing something right now? Great. So this won't come as a surprise to most of you, but there are different types of games. I've put 2 types here. I've put Monopoly, which I hope no one would argue that Monopoly is a skill-based game. Anyone who would argue that, you've just landed on their hotel. Versus chess, which is definitely a skill-based game. One has a lot more random element to it, a bit of chance, more of a narrative, structure and story to it. It's set in London, for example. The pieces each have a meaning, whereas with chess, it's a pretty abstract experience, and it's just one player versus another. Now, I'm not saying that chess is a better viewing experience. In fact, I think Monopoly can be quite fun, although I've never made it to an end of a game. But chess, certainly from a game design perspective, is a different type of game. And we see that parallel in video games too. The next slide I'm going to show you is tennis, right? It is it's a sport, but it's the closest parallel that we have to esports in terms of a genre of game. We have 2 players playing against each other. The rules are very they're well known. There's a formula to them, and the win condition is very specific, and it's repeatable. The narrative, the story that comes out of tennis, is to do with the players. How many times has Federer beat Murray? How many times has Murray beat Federer? How many times has Murray won grass versus clay? These elements are what drives the story around esports. Now, I think a question I was asked earlier in an earlier interview was about game developers. In the UK, why do we have such great game developers, which we have fantastic, but who aren't necessarily big in the esports genre? Well, that's because the game development that we specialise in the UK, Rockstars, Rocksteady, these sorts of guys, are narrative-based games, like Batman Arkham Knight, Grand Theft Auto, that sort of. It's a very different experience to an esports-style game. I'm going to give you an example of that. I think potentially the greatest example of an esport, and one of my favourites, Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike's been around for a long time. In fact, it was made in 1999. It was a Half-Life modification. And the 3 images that I show you here are showing you the evolution of Counter-Strike as a game. So starting off back in 1999, later when Counter-Strike Source was brought in, and then now more recently with Counter-Strike Go. But it looks like the same game, right? The elements are the same, the HUD is the same, the experience is the same, the weapons are the same. The game has lasted for 17 years, and it has very untouched since then. Here we are in a stadium last year watching the world's best Counter-Strike players play. And I'm going to show you a little commonality across the games in a second, because I've got an example of another game here that I want to show you too, which also shares a lot of these traits. But I want to go back actually quickly. I want to say that Counter-Strike, when it came out, it had no single-player mode, it had no bots, It was an online-only experience. There was no tutorial. It's a very hardcore experience for people back at the time. I used to work for a publisher, and I can't really imagine a publisher these days saying to a developer, sure, it doesn't matter if there's no bots or no single player or no tutorial, right? It's a very different, this game is lean and focused for an online competitive experience. There's no hand-holding. And that's the same with Dota. Dota started off as a StarCraft mod, Aeons of Strife, it was called, and then became a Warcraft mod, and then on from there. The game has been relatively the same ever since it launched in 2003. We've had some iterations, League of Legends, Dota 2, but the core is the same today as it was back then. There are over 100 characters in Dota now. It's getting quite complicated, but if you're a fan of Dota back in 2003, you'd understand the game today. And here we are in Frankfurt, a month or two ago, again, watching the best Dota players in the world compete on stage. I think from a viewership perspective, that's really interesting, because for every one person in that crowd, 2,000 people are online watching from home. So they're enjoying this multiplayer experience that the players are experiencing. So what is the commonality between the products? Well, firstly, they're lean and focused products. Second, they've been around for a long time, and they've been iterated upon. And thirdly, there's a low barrier to entry. Both of them started off as free mods that you could just download and play. So let's go back to that original list that we saw earlier, right? 4 of those 12 games, the top 4 games all share that commonality of the lean and focused product, the longevity and iteration. Hearthstone has been around probably the least of the games, but League, Counter-Strike and Dota have been around for a while, and they all have low barrier entry. Free to play, less than $15, free to play, free to play. No wonder that they are the most engaged with games, because they are the most successfully competitive games, and they've built a good narrative around it. So, let's talk about it being a lean and focused product. I mentioned before there was no single-player experience, or it's very limited if there is one. There's a clear and intuitive win condition, and that condition doesn't change. And it seems like common sense, but actually when you look at a lot of games, narrative-based games today, that is different. The play experience is extremely important versus the game experience. It doesn't matter if your game looks visually beautiful, if it's capped at 30 frames per second, right, in order to keep that graphical fidelity. If your game tears, if there's frame rate tears at a certain part of a map, again, that's not going to cut it for a competitive game, for an esports game, because these players today play at 200 frames per second on 144 hertz monitors, and they're very, very strict about that, and rightly so, because they want to remove all the limitations and all the difficulties to be able to project their skill into the game. And finally, it's built for a competitive online experience. The netcode is good. You're able to pause the game. These features are embedded into the DNA of the game, rather than the other way around of creating a game that's great and then adding this esport element to it. It's not going to work. So, well, we talked about longevity and iteration, but it's interesting because today modern publishers, they build a game, they ship it, they run around making a day one patch because they haven't finished the game, and then they forget about it. Well, that doesn't work in esports or in competitive games. You need to commit to balance, and you need to be constantly balancing your game. Counter-Strike's the best example of that because the game wasn't released and forgot about. The game was continually worked on over the time. 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, Source, Condition 0, Counter-Strike Go, and all the patches in between as well. Iterate on what works. When I played Counter-Strike back in the day, we were saving people from 747s, or in a villa in Italy, bringing hostages out. These maps don't translate hadn't translated as well as some of the other maps did in Counter-Strike. So they've been removed from the competitive scene. But don't over-iterate. Don't change the game too much, because if you change the game too much, you change the goalposts. And people are investing their time in building their skills and building their ability in these games. And the more you change a game, the weaker your competitive offering is. And then finally, listen to the community. having API integration and having your stats online is a good thing, not a bad thing. Let's say, for example, one character always beats another character 80% of the time in matchups. Don't be afraid of that and not want to share that information. Share that information. Allow the community to dive into your data as well so that you can create the most balanced game possible. And James is going to talk a little bit more about these sorts of elements a little bit later. And finally, a low barrier to entry. The larger the pool of players, the more competitive your game will be because the skill curve will be greater. But that doesn't mean hand-holding. A low barrier to entry, don't insult your user base by putting in too many tutorials or auto-aim assists for players who aren't as good as other players. And finally, we've talked about engagement already. The most successful esports today are monetizing through engagement. They're keeping the barrier to entry low by having a low price point or a zero price point when the game is launched, and then building upon that monetization through engagement. So the most important thing is to build for esports. I'm just going to have a drink. Here I've put down 4 examples of how you can build for esports specifically. Firstly, the metagame. The game itself can be as complex or as simple as possible, as long as it's competitive. But what we're seeing is a metagame evolve around the esport. Much like, for example, we talked about the tennis analogy. What surface are you playing on? Or in football, are you playing, what formation are you playing? What formation is the team playing in? What striker has been brought off the sub-bench that game at the 11th minute to try and get a last-minute goal? These things are really important because it creates narrative and it creates story. This is a screen from Dota where there's a pick and ban system. There's so many characters in Dota now. Some players are really good with some characters, others are really good with others. Some characters are really good in certain matchups. You may have a team comp that you want to play as, then you need to limit your opponent's ability to deal with that team comp. So the meta game of picks and bans was brought in to, 1, help smooth and keep the game more competitive, but 2, to build that narrative and to build that story around the production and around the spectacle of esports. Secondly, spectator mode. Probably the most important thing. You want people to watch your game. You want people to enjoy other people playing it. So you need tools in order to make that accessible. The spectator mode, this is in Counter-Strike, allows you, the casters, to see through walls who's coming up. Allows the audience to know what the score is. Allows the audience to know which player has how many resources, how much money that they can spend on weapons taking into the next round, knowing how much health someone's on, knowing if someone's got a flashbang or not, knowing how long there is on the bomb timer. These are really important things that make esports so accessible to the viewer, and actually, if it wasn't for this particular tool, I think esports probably wouldn't exist in the form that it has today. Matchmaking, really important as well. It's not fair if someone who's very good is playing against someone who's very bad. You need to have, 1, because it makes the experience more fun, people of equal skill playing against each other, and 2, it gives a progression for players so that they know that they're continually improving their skill, improving their ability. That's really important to put into the game. And finally, production. I think this is a picture that I love very much from our studio in Leicester, and really it shows the professionalism of esports production today, that we see at the front the analysis desk, where experts are talking about the game, where talking about the plays that have happened in the game already. But the audience sitting there can see the players playing, but also in a slick environment, in a professional environment. And right here at the back, actually, probably the tour de force of our studio is the LED wall, which again, as the players go into the map in-game, the LED wall reveals and shows the map in-game. But this esports production is what drives the viewership. And I think that's it for me. I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to talk a little bit more about the technology inside the games. Hang on. It's got a low resolution, so it's...
Oh, yeah. Just to add to a bit of background with ESL, ESL is not a new company. We've been going for 20 years, and throughout those 20 years, we've had a lot of challenges in order to make an environment that would lend any sort of game to a potential esport. So, in fact, some of our oldest partners in the industry have been publishers and developers, of course, in order to work together. Is this going to work? No, something's happened, sorry. There we go. That's not coming up. You open this twice, Spike? Maybe. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to actually use some examples of the technology that we've developed, in keeping in mind that these are all elements that we need in esports in order to develop an esport title. So if you as a developer or publisher came to ESL and said, we'd really like to make our game into an esport, I want to talk about those elements that need to be thought about. And in fact, more often than not, a game becomes very popular and a big player base develops online, and then we get approached and said, oh, we think the community is striving for an esport tournament here. Can you help us out? Can you add that production level? Can you add a tournament platform? And then we say, yeah, but actually we need to go back a few steps and kind of work on that technology side of things, the spectator client that Spike mentioned for a start. So if we look at what we're working on, so the competition is obviously the crux of esports. That's where the tournaments are, that's the ladders, that's the leagues, that's bringing profiles of individuals together to start competing. So that's obviously, in our circumstance, it's on our website or our apps. That can actually be in-game as well. So we see lots of examples where we're lending on existing competition platforms within game. The progression is super important, that user journey. So this is leading on to the engagement element there. What we want to see is that after being matchmate and playing with the right level of competitor, what you want to do is make sure you've got a career path. You want to make sure that you're going somewhere. Maybe one day you'll be on that big stage. So that's super, super important. And while that's happening, obviously, we have to contend with cheating. So that's a massive area that ESL worked in. We work very closely with developers in order to figure out, well, what's the big challenges there, and I've got a slide on that later. And then finally, obviously, being a tournament operator, when we're talking to a developer, we need to look at what tools we can provide each other. So Spike mentioned APIs there, giving access to data within game and multiplayer games. We also lend an SDK the other way, so we want to be able to connect that tournament to the game itself. The other thing, it's platform agnostic. I mean, PCs were very much where esports started. I think that's an obvious point. But consoles are rising rapidly in esports, and then also mobile as well. And we're finding that obviously, a hardcore esports fan is a very multi-screen user. So they will possibly have a console at home. They'll certainly have a smartphone. So we're lending apps, and we're also working with mobile developers in order to make games an esport. So an example here is our Xbox dashboard app. Again, this is something that could be in game. If we take FIFA, for example, or Project Cars, they've got some excellent tournament matchmaking facilities, leagues and ladders, etc. Some of them have actually developed the way of creating tournaments, so users can create tournaments within their game to then set up their own leagues and ladders, which is super cool, and being able to create groups there. I think we're seeing a big trend in that. The ESL Xbox dashboard app, it's a Windows 10 compatible application. It's just an easy experience. So if you're an ESL user, you go in, you find which game you want to play, you go in, what cups are running, what could I win, what's the skill level, and I'll be put into game directly. And depending on which game it is, we do try and work closely with a publisher or a developer in order to make that matchmaking and reporting experience really smooth. So whatever way it's done, that's super important. We don't want the process to be too arduous. So this is an example of, after you finish your game, you're just submitting your score, and as long as everyone's happy, that goes into your profile. Apps were also an obvious thing. So companion apps to actually run a tournament could be super useful. So say, for example, you've got a player base and they're actually wandering around outside and they've kind of forgotten that they've got a match this evening. You could have a companion app to remind them, to give them a push notification, get back home, jump on your console, join in, there's your player, play the game and report the score. So that's super important. And this is quite a new area for us. It's working extremely well. There's obviously different ways of engaging with that user then, but it's super important. Integration, so that's actually when ESL, when we're actually talking to a developer and saying, well, how do we sort of lend on each other's technology? So say, for example, you are a developer, you're thinking, okay, we've got esports in mind, we like this idea of mass multiplayer user base, but we want to eventually have a huge production with someone somewhere where we have a stage and a huge audience. This is super, super important because we need to make sure that user experience is really simple. So inviting those players, automating the results and statistics, and kind of forgotten there is the actual data that's coming out of that game. Spike mentioned it earlier, but we can do a huge amount with that, or you could do a lot of statistics and analysis around that in an esports production. It should never be forgotten. It's hugely important. And this is to give you an idea of a user flow. So you imagine your user is accessing tournament of some sort. It's promoted online through social media, etc. They'll go to one of the platforms to sign in. They pick a tournament or a game. They jump into the tournament system. They're either reporting automatically through a game integration module of some sort, or they're having to manually report it. That's not ideal. And then they're seeing where they rank in that tournament. And while that's all happening, I've touched on anti-cheat. Super, super important. And the other aspect is obviously the referees. How do we actually monitor this? How do we make sure people are saying what they are, saying who they are? How do we make sure that people are actually in the game in the right time, or saying, actually, reporting the right score, etc. So what we do ourselves is use the community to do that with a team of admins, usually voluntary. It's the same we're seeing in many different titles that are leading the way in this competitive platform. The progression, the career mode is super, super important. So starting with matchmaking, making sure you're fitting in the right level. But imagine a situation where you're going in for the first time, you're having your first multiplayer experience, but you know you're not going to be on the stage tomorrow. But you do know that, right, I'm loving this game so much, I'm going to commit myself. So I want to see what that career progression is, from casual to pro. We make it really obvious on our website. We have our major leagues all the way to our pro pinnacle, pictures that you saw earlier. So it really needs to be in that and putting players on a pedestal. And there's so many ways we've seen creativity from developers do that. The anti-cheat side of things, we ourselves have spent a huge amount of time on this because without anti-cheat we wouldn't exist, basically. So we developed an app specifically for PC at first called ESL Wire. We've also lent that technology as well in the past, so we have an SDK that some developers have integrated. It's free of charge for up to 500 concurrent users. But we also have consulted to help developers figure out an anti-cheat in their own right. So that's a super, super important element. And just to touch on some of the common cheating aspects, aimbot in FPS. FPS is a huge genre in esports. Aimbot, trigger bots, extra sentry perceptions, radars and wall hacks, all things I liked in Doom, but there you go. And then MOBAs as well, so map hacks and dodging attacks from your competitor, and also triggering those abilities, so automatically triggering a defense mechanism. I also wanted to quickly touch on this really, really briefly, as thinking about that data flow of those logs and those statistics and stuff. What we've done is develop that into a whole ecosystem here. So we're actually using that data to the nth degree in terms of making sure that our tournaments have a huge integrity level to it. So, we're actually fraud detecting now. We've got partners who are analyzing this on a regular basis and comparing it to the betting industry even. So you imagine a situation where your title does become have a huge player base, and you start seeing tournaments running with, say, $50,000 of prize money. Well, you can start expecting that there's some other sort of dodgy activity going on. So this is a huge importance to making sure that esport will live, and it's just not going to die a death because of match fixing, etc. We usually build a white label platform alongside a tournament. So for example, if you were to develop a game and you're thinking, right, we want to take this into a real competitive play, you want to demonstrate, show that progression as well, put players on a pedestal, put video content in and stuff like that. That's what we do. Obviously, it's lending on that API functionality. So if a developer was to come to us, we're going to say, well, what APIs do you have to offer us? If you're doing that internally or with another partner, it would be the same conversation, of course. So matchmaking, Spike touched on it. Again, this is an element where we've spent a huge amount of time. We have hundreds of thousands of players on our platform. If we're not matchmaking correctly, again, we're going to die a death. There's not going to be any fairness in the competitions running. We need to identify that user and then make sure they're playing in the right competition. What we like to do as ESL, again, is work with a developer to swap APIs and an SDK to really make that a very smooth process. Some of our longest partners in esports with some of the titles we've done, a lot of our technology is living inside that title. And it just grows the success of that being a platform to create a viewership. And really, just to finish up now, I just want to draw a map, really, of all the elements within kind of the esports toolbox. So in terms of what you need to think about to actually make that game from a development side an esport. We've touched on the game statistics, the scheduling, what the apps look like, game integrations, anti-cheat, the CM system, the portal that we talked about, the database, the profiles of those users, players, and how you utilize all of that. Obviously, you can see that there's probably a lot of those elements that may not have been thought about when you just initially start developing a game. And then on the other side of things, just to touch on how we've what's the front end of that process. So what have we to create a product, a production? We're obviously not the only people creating tournaments. We have a whole cross section. So for example, Riot Games, they're actually doing all of this on their own in-house, every single thing from the production down to the APIs, etc. Obviously, that's not exclusive to them, and other people lend on that. But there is a huge amount to think about, and it's obviously part of the growing industry as it stands. I would say that when esports sort of started developing, it was very much a marketing tool to a publisher or a developer because of growing that engagement piece or the retention. But really what's happening is that developers are now looking at esports being part of that integral development process. We saw with Overwatch, for example, first time esports for years and years and years. So for the first time, they've actually put an esports professional within their development team. So we were quite surprised. Well, we're very pleased to see that. But we can see the trend there forming, that it's becoming a very thought-out process. And that concludes the side of the development. Any questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering, don't you think that sometimes developing for esports is kind of putting the cart before the horse a bit, and that you need the player drive to actually want a game to become an esport before you can actually make it an esport? Like, obviously Blizzard have pulled it off with Overwatch, but for every one of those, aren't there 100 other games that have been developed as an esport but not made it?
I'm going to say no. Going back to the basics of what we mentioned originally, if you make your game competitive and balanced and a multiplayer experience, it has the potential to be an esport. If you don't do those things, it will never be an esport. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So for example, I said earlier, so many publishers come to us or developers come to us and say, "Oh, the community wants this esports tournament." We say, "Okay, great. Have you got a spectator client?" They're like, "No." We're like, "Oh, it's really difficult then, isn't it?" So we have to sort of, it starts costing lots of money, basically, on the production side of things to try and rejig things, taking development processes out. Maybe that's impacting, future developments on titles, etc. And all the time we're being shocked by what that drive of a community is from this competitive gaming communities, where they're coming with games. We're seeing trends. We don't decide which game becomes an esport. We just wait. And then suddenly we're like, "Oh, there's loads of tournaments going on here. What's going on?" And it's almost like, why did Twitch exist? They were just in TV. They didn't know that people watching gaming was ever going to be popular. But suddenly they're like, "Oh, hang on a second, there's a trend here." So I think I'm not a developer, but it could be that there's some fundamental elements there that wouldn't cost too much to think about right at the beginning that you could integrate. Even look at some of the toolboxes we've got available to help that process, or other competitors of ours, and look and see if it's possible. But I think it's a really good point, a really great point. But we would obviously urge you that we'd think otherwise.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I wanted to get your kind of opinion on player counts a little bit and suitability for esports, because especially with that like Twitch list you showed, a lot of the esports that get a lot of attention seem to either be sort of 1v1 or 5v5 or some kind of number around there is kind of the general trend, right? And that doesn't necessarily apply to real sports, where like American football I think has like 30 people in a team or something crazy. So I'm kind of interested, do you think there's a limitation with esports where player counts need to be low enough that people can understand what's going on, or do you think there is like a potential for more kind of huge, big team experiences in the future, and maybe we're just not there yet in terms of engagement? I'm just kind of interested in whether there have been any success stories that maybe I'm not aware of where, you see larger teams competing on a regular basis.
I think you could start by saying, well, why are we even talking about esports right now? And it's because really the awareness of esports has really boomed in the last few years because of mainly broadband speeds and online platforms to make a production. I mean, we've been trying to do that for ages, so finally we could do it, we could achieve it. But so going back to your question, I think the actual titles themselves will evolve. I mean, we're already seeing, who would have thought that we would see an esport on a mobile game, for example? I mean, we were just having a conversation then, how could we esportify Pokemon Go? That would be great. People running around the field and trying to capture points. Who knows? So I think that's kind of your job, hopefully. And we can't wait. Yeah. So really it's about putting that creativity into a game, start seeing how the community react to it, and as long as you think about, you know, what our needs are, then, you know, it could actually happen in any format whatsoever. Do you have anything to add? Sorry.
I also respectfully disagree again. You know, Halo's 4v4, right? Overwatch is 6v6. Counter-Strike's 5v5. Vainglorious 3v3. I was in Brazil a while ago, and a guy came up to me and said, "Oh, cool, we play competitive FIFA." I said, "Great. Tell me about the format." He said, "We play 11 versus 11." Right? So, why not?
Yeah, no, that's. I mean, we do. I mean, it's interesting. We have like 32v32 in our sort of base game, and my instinct, if we want to support esports, is I need to go. Oh, I mean, maybe it needs to be 8v8 or.
Yeah. Or World of Tanks 7v7, right?
Yeah. Like
all these permutations exist.
Okay.
I think if we just touch on some of the physical challenges, so if it was a 32 vs 32, and we ended up. I mean, actually, this came up with Battlefield because obviously it was a large player map there. When we actually bring them to the stage, and if you think we start dealing with this massive number of players, and the fan base works differently, obviously, you know, with the amount of people you have to remember, etc., it might have an impact. So it could be that you have a version with a lower player base, but I don't think it would never exist, I would say.
Yeah, thanks.
We've got time for one more? About 5 minutes or so. Okay, great. This lady here?
All the way back.
Oh, we missed her. I'll do a Dimbleby. I meant the blonde girl there. I'm joking, that's fine.
Hi, I'm Julia from London Venture Partners. I wanted to ask, do you have statistics on which devices people watch tournaments? What's the split between PC and mobile?
Is that watching Twitch, you mean, basically? Or the
Yeah.
content that we create?
Yes, watching.
Absolutely.
Not off the top of our heads, I don't think.
I think it's a very high percentage on mobile. I think 50s.
I don't know. We'll
Grab
email
the
you.
card and
Okay,
I'll send
thank
you
you.
the stats.
Blonde girl?
Hi. So you see a lot of esports are generally like FPS games, or they're conflict-oriented games. Do you think that kind of like conflict-driven gameplay is kind of a key to success in esports? Is it a necessary factor for esports, or can there be different kinds of...
I think it comes back to the sports analogy, right, of tennis, or these of one person competing against another person, or a team against a team. I'm trying to rack my brain for any cooperative...
Rocket League came out of nowhere, for example. We're quite surprised by that. I think Clash Royale now is creating a lot of competitive content. We just worked with Supercell in Helsinki on an amazing event there. It's just incredible to think that this is actually happening. MOBA platform on MOBAs on the mobile platform Vainglory is doing extremely well. And even poker is coming into play here as well. So we're starting to see poker being watched a lot on Twitch and leagues and stuff like that forming.
Yeah, because you mentioned like Pokemon Go, like, and so I was wondering like what kind of sort of kind of innovative developments you'd like to see in the esports space around sort of different kinds of competitive play, essentially.
I think it comes
not
to...
necessarily conflict-oriented.
Yeah, I think literally any format that has a competitive element that's really good fun would work. The only challenge for us is how we get that content out. So what's that spectator client? Well, if it's Pokemon Go and they're running around in a field, we'd probably need to attach some sort of webcam to them and track and then somehow get the game feed coming through. And so there's all those elements. But as long as we're kind of ticking that box on you know, that overview slide, it can happen, and it would be really good fun. I mean, Twitch is quite fun really because they do experiment on things. Twitch Plays Pokemon was really interesting format where, you know, I'm not sure you're all aware, but it relied on Twitch chat to play the actual game. I know that's not esports, but if you think we're lending on the fact it's creating an entertainment from people watching people playing games. you know, there's been some really interesting stunts. People control the Old Spice man, for example, where the Twitch chat was controlling the guy in I think the Australian bush, I think, and saying, do this, do that. I know that's not an e-sport, but a huge amount of people started to watch that. It created a huge amount of entertainment. That could have been competitive. It could have been two guys, and they're trying to attack each other. I don't know.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Any more, or are we good? This gentleman here.
Hi. Obviously, we've seen greater success in PC and esports, and I'm just wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about what some of the maybe specific challenges are for console games to sort of become bigger in the esports arena.
I think there's an old saying, the medium is the message, and I think that's true for esports. PC gaming obviously has set the bar, because you could just alt-tab, right? And there was your IRC chat, and there was your Skype chat, and there was your ESL Play platform to work out the tournament bracket. And consoles are very different. Having a what's that football player with the moth? Having a very consoles a very different experience than traditionally has been. It hasn't always been a connected experience. Only very recently, with this generation, did we really see 360 and last gen also, that connected experience on the console. Obviously, first-person shooters do very well, but it's a controller versus a mouse and keyboard. So there are lots of idiosyncratic differences between the two, which I think have made console esports lag a little bit behind. Also, the barrier to entry as well is another, going back to the original slide, the barrier to entry is higher on a console. But with the advent of second screening and having a tablet there, your mobile there, of API integrations, as consoles and PCs homogenize and become ultimately the same thing in the future, esports has boomed. Halo, Call of Duty,
Mortal
Kombat, Street Fighter, really good examples of games which have done really well. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Great. Cool. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. That was great. Here you go.